can start. Could I have the next slide, please? Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Carbon Future webinar on European carbon removal policy in 2025. My name is Sebastian Manhart. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor at Carbon Future, and I'm very excited to host this group of speakers today. If you are in carbon removal, you will have noticed that a lot has been happening in Europe when it comes to carbon removal policy, both at the European Union level, but also in nation states and member states. And what we thought we were going to do today was to bring together some of the people who are really driving these policies forward. And so I'm very happy today that we are joined by representatives that I'll introduce in a second from Switzerland, from the European Union, and from Germany. And they will provide you with unique insights into what's actually been happening across the continent. Next slide, please. So what we hope to deliver to you today, to the audience, is first, really understanding more how policies interact with demand for carbon removal. I think we all know at this point that that's the biggest nut to crack, is how do we generate demand for this market that needs to scale over the next 20, 30, 40 plus years. And so we're going to talk about how policies can support that. A big topic of interest to all of you, as I'm sure, is compliance markets, and essentially how do we move from an industry that is in the voluntary carbon market increasingly to compliance markets. And Europe, again, is really leading the way on this as far as CDR is concerned. Then we want to look at supply as well, because obviously we need to scale the companies that are actually delivering the carbon removal. And a lot has been done on that front already, as I'm sure we're going to hear. MRV, and especially the monitoring, reporting, and verification, I should explain the acronyms. MRV is really essential. And we want to talk and explore how essentially MRV and the trust that it can create can help us move these policies to maturity. And finally, we hope to make it as action-oriented and practical as possible, especially for the buyers and suppliers in the audience, which from the registrations we've seen, there's many of you there. Next slide, please. At Carbon Future, we are very involved with policy on a number of fronts. We are engaged in a lot of the trade associations that you will see on the screen. We also produce guides that I'll talk about in a second, webinars like this one, and also, as you might know, I also run a policy podcast with Evetame, where we touch on a lot of these topics. Next slide, please. If you haven't seen it yet, we released very recently the guide to carbon removal policy. This is the third time we've done it, and it's a very extensive 45-page report on carbon removal policy, focusing specifically on what the policies at global level mean to buyers and suppliers, looking at every single policy and what that could mean to you specifically in your company and what you should be doing as a result. Next slide. This year, we've also extended the geographical scope. So we're covering the countries and regions that you see represented here today, but we also go beyond it. And we've really tried to capture all the key geographies where we see things happening. We'll have to update the Canada chapter after last night, I suppose. But again, that seems to be very good news for CDR. So more on that shortly. But yeah, you will see that the report has a lot of extensive coverage on that. Next slide. So yeah, if you haven't checked it out yet, make sure to download it. It's completely free. It can really be kind of the one-stop resource that you can look at when it comes to just getting up to speed with any of the policies that are happening around the world. It used to be quite easy. There used to be only one or two things happening. Now, thankfully, there are a lot more things to track. Next slide, please. And now let's move to the main part of the webinar. So for today, we've got Sophie Wenger from Switzerland, who's the Climate Policy Officer for the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment. We've got Fabien Ramos, the Carbon Removal Lead at the European Commission, and Jörg Rüger, the Desk Officer for Carbon Dioxide Removal at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action. And the way that this will work today is we'll first hear very briefly, just a few minutes from each of them to give you kind of a bit of context, a quick overview of how their respective government offices have been working on CDR and pushing the topic forward. And then we have a range of questions that I've prepared, things that I would love to talk to them about, including questions that you, when you signed up, already submitted to us. So we went through all the questions and picked up the ones that we thought were most relevant to this audience. But then also we're going to have audience questions. So by all means, please use the the question function in Zoom and submit your questions, and we'll feed them into the second part of this webinar. So with that, I would like to hand over to the first input, which is going to come from Fabien. So yeah, over to you, Fabien.
Thank you, Sebastian. Very happy to be here today for this discussion. I'll try to cover in my 3 minutes all the points, or most of the points that you already mentioned in terms of demand, supply, MOV, etc., to give you an update of what is going on at the level of the European Commission. So one of the most recent news is about the certification for carbon removal, CRCF, where we are developing methodology for carbon removals. And the good news is that now we are at a very advanced stage in terms of direct air capture and CCS, in terms of bio-CCS, in terms of biochar, but also the other good news linked to this framework is that we are starting also the discussion very soon on other type of carbon removal. So on not only these three ones for which we will have, I think, if we are a bit optimistic, I think it's very feasible. We'll have a methodology towards the end of the year. For public consultation, a draft methodology over the summer, and an official methodology at the end of the year. But we are also looking at the feasibility to have to enlarge the CSCF to go for more methodology, also related to open system, and we are very excited about that. So this is the point on trying to put in place the MRV that we need for the integration of carbon removal in the EU policies. Now, in terms of demand, we are entering in a phase at the level of the European Union where a lot of work has to be done towards 2026. Because in 2026, we have this review clause from the ETS that is committing the European Commission to look at the feasibility to develop carbon removal in the context of an emission trading. So there are different options on that. We have already some events organized by some colleagues. We have a public consultation that is ongoing. So if you look at the public consultation for the ETS, you will find few questions about carbon removals, and your input in this public consultation is very welcome, of course. But when we talk about linking removals to EU policies, this is not only about ETS. There might be also a potential to link carbon removals to other policies. We have the effort sharing regulation in Europe. What is going to happen to the effort sharing regulation after post-2030? What it will become? Is there a role for carbon removal in this context? We have, of course, when we talk about carbon removal today, I suppose we focus on permanent removal, but the European Commission is also looking at temporal removals, and we have everything related to LULUCF aspects, obviously. So yes, an important work stream starting now, or that has already started, I should say, and till 2026. When in 2026, let's see, no date fixed yet, but definitely a lot of development that will come in the next 1 or 2 years. Maybe I can also mention very briefly the European Climate Law. Even if the Commission have not proposed anything yet at the level of European Climate Law, we know that there are some discussion ongoing on what should be in the European Climate Law. So interesting things to follow up on that. And my last point will be on developing the demand, not only through a regulatory framework, but also through voluntary purchases of removals. And I would like to mention one event that we're organizing on the 21st of May. There will be a discussion on the feasibility to develop a purchasing program for carbon removal at the level of the European Union. So a platform to facilitate the purchasing of carbon removals. So to put in contact buyers and providers of removals. So we are organizing an event at the level of the European Commission on that in May. So maybe I can stop here for now, and very happy to have this to develop these points further after that.
Thank you, Fabien. And I mean, there's a lot that you touched on. I'm sure my Carbon Future colleagues are ready to post links to a lot of the consultation and events that you already mentioned. Maybe a quick question that I have for you, just because you've been working on removals in Europe for years and you've really seen kind of how the industry has developed. How do you see, like, what are your main takeaways in terms of how the industry, the carbon removal industry, and the supplier base as well, how that has changed since you started working on the topic?
Myself, I started to work on the topic in 2018, and 2018 is a totally different era on carbon removals. In 2018, we didn't have yet the long-term strategy. And I think the long-term strategy has been, the European long-term strategy in the context of the Paris Agreement has been a key enabler for the discussion on carbon removal, because it was for the first time that we put on a paper of the European Commission that we needed to have carbon removals to achieve our climate ambitions. And from that point, I think there is many things that have been developed on the level of the policies, of course, with the CSCF, but also at the level of private initiatives. All these off-takers, for instance, that we have now, we didn't have them in 2018. There are also some type of carbon removals that were at a much earlier stage of development, I would say, in 2018. And today we start to get more and more information on that. People looking, if we talk about MRV, there is a lot of initiative going on, and we start to have common agreement on how to address some specific issues for complicated methodology like enhanced rock weathering, etc., where we have the industry is organizing a little bit on that. So still a lot of things to develop, but we have, I think that I would say what has been developed a lot is the industry of carbon removals. The subsectors of the industry of carbon removals are much better organized today than they were in 2018.
Excellent. Good to hear. Thanks, Fabien. Over to Switzerland. So, Sophie, over to you.
Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm happy to share 3 key highlights regarding Swiss CDR policy. So first of all, also as Fabien mentioned, the strategic element, Switzerland has a very clear vision of the need to develop CDR for hard to abate emissions and to reach the Swiss long-term targets. And also, maybe specific to Switzerland, we have a clear view of the need for international cooperation because we have limited domestic storage potential. So we are in need of export opportunities also for biogenic CO2, but also we are in need of CDR procurement in the long term because we will have to be a net buyer of CDR in line with the rules of the Paris Agreement. So I'm talking about Article 6. And we have first estimates on our need for CDR dating back to our long-term climate strategy from 2021. And in our update from 2025, we also identified an additional need for international aviation in the year 2050. And this leads me to my second point. Since early this year, we have a new framework climate legislation in place. It's called the Climate and Innovation Act, which is rather explicit about the need for CDR for binding net zero targets, which are enshrined in this law, and it also provides incentives for early action. So we have several targets in there. We have targets for Switzerland, a net zero target by 2050, net negative thereafter. And the net zero target also includes international aviation, so CDR demand from there as well. Interestingly, we also have net zero targets for Swiss companies by 2050, the latest, for scope 1 and 2 emissions. We also recommend to include scope 3. We also have a net zero target for the Swiss administration by 2040, scope 1, 2, and 3. And this will also, all these actors will require CDR at some point. Within this framework, to help Swiss companies on their decarbonization journey, also funding is available from the federal budget in the order of 1.2 billion Swiss francs. And we have now set aside for a start 100 million for a CCS and CDR call, which we issued early this year. And we hope to be able to communicate by the end of the year which projects will receive funding. So if as a Swiss company you want funding, then you are required to work out a net zero roadmap. For other companies, it is optional. They're free to do that. And in this roadmap, you must define an ambitious reduction path for your scope 1 and 2 emissions, scope 3 recommended. And particularly if you have residual emissions, you are required to define a build-up path for CDR. And there we recommend to draw the build-up path in a linear manner starting before 2030. And to implement this path, the companies can either produce CDR within their company, but in most cases they will likely have to procure credits, and the credits they will have to procure will have to be issued by the Swiss government on the basis of a crediting scheme we've been running for some time. It's also possible to use CDR credits from the voluntary carbon market for this build-up path as an additional measure which companies can mention in the roadmap. And as a third point, which I think is particularly exciting also, is that we have a growing pipeline of Swiss projects domestically, but also with international components, and which are very useful to learn together with project developers and also partnering countries. So we have a handful of projects which will be capturing biogenic CO2 from the waste sector and storing it in Switzerland in concrete or exporting to European storage sites. And we're talking about 10,000 tons of CO2 per year. But we also expect to have more industrial scale projects by 2030, also from the waste sector or from the funding which we are providing. And also, which I think is exciting, is we are exploring together with Norway and Sweden the potential of doing a first pilot CDR transaction under the Paris Agreement together with the private sector. So with potential suppliers and sellers and buyers and sellers to transfer a symbolic amount. Then looking forward for the phase after 2030, we're currently working on a legislative proposal, which we want to put up for consultation early next year. And there the aim is really to have a robust framework in place, which to the extent possible is based on the polluter pays principles to allow for sustained growth to help reach the Swiss targets.
Thank you so much, Sophie. And for me, it's incredible how Switzerland is punching above its weight when it comes to CDR. Like you're leading on so many different fronts, and I'm sure we're going to touch on that throughout this discussion. And also every time I go, like Zurich has become such a hub for CDR, for example. So it's really incredible. Maybe one quick follow-up question for you. And I'm glad that you mentioned the word target so many times in what you just said, because Switzerland has managed to set so many like specific targets, like no other country that I'm aware of. And I've always wanted to ask, like, how did this come about? Like, how did you end up with not just specific targets for different milestone years, but even how much you're going to procure from abroad, right? Yeah, how did it come about?
Well, we have to differentiate between binding targets and indicative targets. So it's true. We have several binding targets in this new framework agreement. However, I must stress it's a framework agreement, so we do not have any relevant binding measures at this stage to really ensure that we can reach the targets. This is something we still have to work on, and which will particularly be a big task for the phase after 2030. And there we'll have to do the whole political process and potentially referendums, etc. So there's still a lot of work ahead. But I think that these targets are really already very important to help shift the mindset, also the net zero targets for the companies, which makes them aware of the fact, okay, by 2050 I have a binding target. I may want to start thinking about how I want to get there, and also for them knowing that we are working on defining measures and policy instruments to get there. Right, and then there are more of the indicative targets, like the potential need from abroad, etc., which we derive from the strategic documents we have, but which are certainly also helpful to frame the views of all the relevant actors on where we want to go.
Excellent. And I think on the topic of binding targets, I think that's a good transition as well to Germany, at least when there was some interesting news around its net zero target, right? So Jörg, over to you for your input. Jörg, yeah, now I think.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now I'm unmuted. Yeah, thanks again for having me here as well. I'm in charge for negative emission in the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action in Germany. The name of the ministry will change as we will have a new government starting next week. We developed a strategy on negative emissions in Germany because we want to reach net zero latest by 2045 and net negativity after 2050. But as some of you might know, our government collapsed end of last year, and we had early elections in February. So we didn't finish the strategy, but we are waiting for the new government. There are some exciting news for this round. There's a coalition agreement between two parties who will elect next Tuesday Friedrich Merz as new chancellor for Germany. And in this coalition agreement, it it mentions negative emissions already. So there it acknowledges CDR. It says, of course, we need to reduce more, but it says we need CDR in Germany, we need CDR in Europe, and this is really new, we need to use, we need to buy or somehow get negative emission CDR from outside of Europe as well. So we will see some Article 6 discussions from the German side as well. Yeah, that's my really short 2 to 3 minutes introduction. What I can elaborate a little bit more about is our climate law. There we have separate targets for emission reduction and targets for CDR. One part is on LULUCF, so natural things, and the other part is on industrial things. And for industrial things, the target values are yet to be determined, and we are in this process on how to set those targets, but we're waiting for the new government and actually agreeing on them. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Jörg. There you go. And you, one question that I have for you is, how do you expect, because obviously you've been working on CDR and also your video has gone off, at least on my end. Are you still with us, Jörg? Yeah. Yes. There you go. I wanted to ask you, how do you see the prospect of CDR also changing with the new government coming in? Because obviously in the old government, that's when the work on the negative emission strategy really started. But as you said, there was less of a mandate, for example, officially in the coalition treaty. Whereas with the new government, it seems to be, at least in the coalition treaty from the beginning. What do you think that could mean for carbon removal in Germany?
Yeah, the big question will be, how much money do we have? For all new government, it's a big question. So with all the questions or the topics you indicated at the beginning of the seminar, like public procurement and stuff like that, we need money. Yeah, and I'm not sure how much money will be allocated in this area. So we still have to wait a couple of weeks to see how it goes. But what I can say, from the coalition treaty, which is public, it states that we will make use of Article 6. So we need to buy from abroad somehow, yeah. But how it will work out, we will see. And who will buy, we will see. If it's the government or if it's included in some mechanism like CETS or others, where companies are able to buy in other countries, we have to wait and see. But this is it's new for our discussions here in Germany. I know you in Switzerland, you're faster than we are, but we are at this point now as well that we discuss how can we buy under Article or cooperate under Article 6 as well. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Jörg. And I think this makes an ideal segue to kind of the questions, the moderated questions. Because actually, Sophie, Switzerland is kind of the country trying to actually experiment with this, right? Like you're actually trying to make this work. You're trying to see how you could have Article 6 trades, I guess, for carbon removal. So maybe explain to us, what are you doing and what are you learning? Yeah, I'm sure that's very useful for everyone, given where Europe and Germany and everyone else is at right now.
Well, for some, Swiss climate policy has already relied for several years also on international cooperation. This is a political decision. So we try, of course, to reduce as much as possible domestically, but our power sector is almost carbon free, and the main emitting sectors are transport and buildings, and industry is also doing its share in reducing. So it's not that easy to reduce quickly, and that's why we also require international climate cooperation, mainly in the field of reduction so far. And for that, we have so far based ourselves on bilateral cooperation under Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement, and we've concluded around a dozen of agreements with partnering countries to ensure that any transfers of mainly reductions, but in principle also removal, are done in line with the rules of the Paris Agreement, notably no double counting at state level. And we've also we've done the first transfer, the ITMO transfer, internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, with Thailand, and then we're really learning along the way. We're also, of course, closely observing what is happening under the multilateral crediting mechanism, so 6.4. It's called Paris Agreement Crediting Mechanism, I think. So, of course, once that is in place, it will certainly be easier, because doing all these bilateral agreements is quite it's a lot of work. So this is something which we expect in the future could also be a large intermediate supplier of credits. Now, using Article 6 for CDR is a newer field, and there, as I mentioned, with Norway and Sweden, we are doing first steps, baby steps, to test this out, also with symbolic volumes, so everybody is comfortable, particularly also the private sector, to try this out.
Very, very cool. And I don't know, Fabien, because I know in Europe this topic has been at EU level. This topic has been heating up quite a lot lately in terms of the use of international credits at the 2040 targets. So I don't know if you can speak to that, but how do you see the use of international credits, and maybe even what the work that you've been doing on the CSCF, how that could relate to that and so on?
Yeah, I think you're right, Sebastian. Recently, there were some discussion about the potential use of international credit in Europe, but all these discussions were not in discussion triggered by the European Commission itself. I think it's more discussion that is happening in some member states. Some member states have expressed some wishes, but yet the European Commission did not do any concrete proposal on the use of credits in the context of our climate law. The current climate law is a domestic effort, so the commitment of the European Union to be climate neutral by 2050, it's domestic, so without the use of any international credit. If we want to open the door to international credit in this objective, to achieve this objective, of course, it's a quite significant change to the current climate law, and it will need a lot of discussion and trying to find some agreement between all the member states and the European Parliament, of course, with the different groups of the European Parliament. What I can say that the CSCF has been developed in a way also reflects some of the concern of some member states in this crediting mechanism, because they were afraid that by generating carbon removals in the EU and selling them in the voluntary carbon market, part of the benefit of generating these carbon removals might leave the member state and to go towards the residual reductions, where is the private buyer of the carbon removal. So all the discussions related to the corresponding adjustment were quite substantial in the context of the negotiation of the CSCF. And the conclusion of this discussion was that it's clear in the legal text that any carbon removal generated in the EU in the context of the CSCF should be accounted towards the EU NDC. So, of course, this constraint has some consequences when we talk about potential supply of credits from Europe towards partners at the international level. I think this is what we can say today. Probably once we'll have a clearer proposal for the 2040 that becomes public, and when we have an official proposal of the European Commission to the European Parliament and the Council, then we'll have more elements to discuss. But for now, difficult to say more.
Excellent. No, and I know it's also a fairly sensitive issue in Europe. So yeah, we'll watch it closely. And there's some questions coming in from the audience, and actually one I'll start with you, Jörg, but it actually applies I think, to all of you in some shape or form. So somebody asked why or observed that in the coalition treaty, the only technology that was called out specifically is direct air capture, right? And they were asking kind of, why the emphasis on direct air capture in Germany. So maybe I can start with you, Jörg, just how you see kind of the technology landscape and how potentially the German government might approach it. But I'd love to hear also from Sophie and Fabien, because I know, Sophie, for you, there's a heavy focus on, BECS, bio-CCS, Fabien, ETS, it's DAX and BECS. So I think there's a general question around which technologies are kind of getting chosen or promoted that I'd love to hear about. But yeah, Jörg, maybe starting with you about in Germany.
As I'm not a politician and I was not there drafting this coalition treaty, I cannot answer the question why it was written like that. But I can state we have a lot of discussions on biomass in Germany when it comes to negative emission and the use of biomass. So every time we write something, we will do BECS and stuff like that, it gets complicated. And when someone says DAX, it's easier because you just need basically electricity or energy. So sometimes it might be simple reasons as those that it just mentions DAX at this particular point in the document. So I don't want to interpret too much in there, and it does not say we only want to do DAX and nothing else. So we will see what the new government and the new ministers will have for ideas, but from my perspective, we are open to all technologies, and it will stay that way for negative emissions.
If I may, I would say that in a way, I think it's a good thing that DAX get a bit of a clear mention like it is in Germany, because when we look at what is the current landscape on carbon removals and what can deliver in the next 5-10 years significant amount of carbon removals, due to the cost of DAX, it's unlikely that DAX will be the main source of carbon removals. When we look at the current projects that we are supporting with the Innovation Fund, for instance, it's more about bio-CCS, or BECS, or industrial processes generating biogenic emissions that are captured and stored. So if member states start to point specifically at a technology like direct air capture, I see it as a good thing. Why? Because direct air capture, when all the modeling that we are doing at the level of the European Commission show that due to the constraint that you said on biomass resources, it's unlikely that we can achieve our 2050 objective without a technology such as direct air capture, being for doing negative emissions, being for generating SAF, sustainable aviation fuel. We will need to capture CO2 and to do something out of CO2. And if we do not start today to clearly support the development of this technology, we'll never manage to get the number that we need in 2050. So in a way, I see it's good. But at the level of the European Union, we do not want to focus on only one type of carbon removal. I think it's very important to be open. And that's why, as I said in introduction, for the CSCF, we look at really a portfolio of carbon removal, and we try to enlarge this portfolio. We have 3 now. We are working on 2 others, being mineralization in concrete, for instance, and enhanced rock weathering. And we are also starting the review of methodologies related, for instance, to ocean, so direct ocean capture or ocean alkalinity enhancement and these kind of solutions. Not saying that everything will be linked to the ETS. I think we should not give this expectation, but we need to find the right instrument to promote the technologies, the practices, the approaches that we need for the future, and that we identify as having a clear potential to generate a significant amount of carbon removal, and that can be measured, reported, and verified in a proper way to make sure that what we support has a climate benefit.
I can maybe add for the Swiss side, with regards to any potential technology preferences or not, I can say that from a legal perspective, we are technology open when it comes to any domestically produced CDR. So any kind of CDR which is produced in Switzerland will be visible, should be visible in our inventory, and then automatically counts towards our target. Then from a legal perspective, when we procure CDR from abroad, we have some limitations. Currently, we limit it to what you call industrial CDR, so mainly BECS and DACs, but we also opened up for the use of biochar in construction products. So there we try to limit it to technologies which are easier to monitor in respect to durability, because we credit these these technologies or the resulting negative emissions, and then we're also accountable for it. So there we are a bit careful. We have some indications in our long-term climate strategy based on modeling, energy modeling, etc., on what will likely or potentially be the technologies which will be implemented in the future. And as you said, Sebastian, a strong focus in Switzerland is on BECS in relation to waste biomass, so mainly in the context of waste incineration plants. And we do not really see DACs taking off in Switzerland because of limited energy. So we also we are shifting, according to our energy strategy, from nuclear energy to full renewable energy, and we will need that to electrify and decarbonize, etc. So limited energy, and also, as I mentioned, limited domestic storage. We currently do not know at this stage if we will have enough geological storage, if we can develop it at all. So no DACs really in Switzerland, or no relevant DACs units likely.
And if I can jump right from there, because one question that was pre-submitted was around CO2 storage, right? And there is a need for a lot of CO2 storage and pipelines and God knows what, right? If we want to make this work, especially direct air capture, BECS, bio-CCS. Maybe starting with you, Fabien, but Jörg, I know that it's also a huge topic in Germany, carbon management, CCS infrastructure. So anything you want to add as well, Sophie? How are we going to create all the CCS infrastructure that we need to achieve both the point source CCS objectives and, I guess, the DAX bio CCS BECS objectives? You're still on mute, Fabien.
Yeah, sorry. This is an essential question. This is really the enabling factors that we'll need if we want to be serious on generating the amount of carbon removal that we need for our neutrality in Europe. And this was something on which we looked at when we were developing the communication last year on industrial carbon management. We have also this regulation. So first, infrastructure. As you said, Sebastian, infrastructure is not only making sure that you have the injection capacity so that you can inject the CO2 in geological formation if you want to store CO2, for instance. Infrastructure is also to transport the CO2 from where it has been captured to where it will be stored. And these are two different elements. For the injection capacity, we have in Europe what we call the Net Zero Industrial Act that has an article that is giving obligations to oil and gas industries to provide injections capacity. And we had a public consultation very recently on the methodology to allocate this obligation to different oil and gas companies. So it's very simple. It's a pro rata. So more you are producing oil and gas that are sold in Europe, more you share of this 50 million ton, because the total target is a 50 million ton for 2030, will be to deliver this as the injection capacity on your side. And we had a public consultation last year, and I think if everything goes well, and I don't see a reason why it should not go well, this delegated act that will be that is specifying this methodology and all the elements around will be adopted next month, in May or June, the latest. So we have that. It's a very good starting point, because before we didn't have anything on that, and we have now this obligation at the level of oil and gas industries to deliver by 2030 50 million ton. The question is, 50 million ton is already a good starting point. Probably we'll need to do more. And how are we going to do that? But this is for injection. For transport of CO2, we need also to develop the infrastructure in Europe. We need to agree on standards, for instance, to transport the CO2. We need many things, and our colleague in particular in DG Energy, so the colleagues working on the energy department of the European Commission, are preparing, I think for next year now, what I will call here a CO2 package. So to try to develop all the regulations, all the legislation that is needed to allow the development of the infrastructure, with a lot of also consequences or important elements for cross-border transport of CO2. And I'm sure Sophie has also an interest in that, because when Switzerland wants to store CO2 capture in Switzerland in the North Sea, for instance, they have to cross over a few countries such as Germany. And what is happening with potential leakages that goes during the transportation of the CO2 from Switzerland to Germany and all this. So we need to develop the hardware, and we need to develop the kind of, if I can call that the software, the legislation that goes together, that we are making sure there is no problem when not everything is going right from the capture site to the storage site. So there are elements, development that are important, and we have started some of this development, and others will come next year.
Yeah, I fully agree with Fabien. It's absolutely critical that we can develop these infrastructures in a timely manner. And there I must say Switzerland lags behind a bit. On the one side, we are not an oil and gas country, so we have limited underground data. And on the other hand, when it comes to pipeline and underground storage, the main competences are at subnational level. So with the cantons, with regards to permitting, etc. And if you want to develop a national pipeline infrastructure and you have to go to every single canton and they don't know what they have to do, it becomes very tedious. So we are now in the process of developing harmonized national regulation. We actually have a mandate from Parliament, so there's awareness there too. That's very important. And of course, we also have to ensure that we are technically also well interconnected with neighboring infrastructure in Germany, for instance. Right, and also when it comes to the questions Fabien mentioned with regards to leakage and accounting, etc., that's where we were such big fans of first pilot projects and early action, because we have small volumes, the risks are small, and we can also closely, for instance, also with the Commission together, understand what the legislative framework is and ensure that everything is also done in a legally sound manner. And there, I think potentially also the ETS regulation is helpful for this specific case, because the Commission has recently clarified that any CO2 which crosses the border from Switzerland to the EEA with the intention of being durably stored in a permitted underground storage site is within the scope of the EU ETS. So for these projects that I mentioned that will be exporting biogenic CO2, if there is any leakage, the transport operator and also the storage operator will have to monitor it, they will have to report, and they will also have to submit ETS emission allowances.
Excellent. And maybe kind of, if you want to switch gears a little bit, because I see that another topic that keeps coming up in the question is rightly demand, right? Like right now, the demand for carbon removals is really the voluntary carbon market and for durable carbon removals. And it comes down to very few companies who account for the vast majority of the demand. And so a lot of people are looking to governments to do something, right? To like, how can you incentivize, I guess, not beyond kind of direct procurement or something, how can you incentivize corporate demand? And so yeah, Jörg, maybe if you can talk about how you think about it, like how does, for example, and you can start, but I know that both Fabien and Sophie are definitely doing work on this too. How are you thinking that the negative emission strategy could lead to more demand? Like, what's the link there, if at all? Maybe there isn't one, and it's just focused on public demand. But I'm curious if that has played a factor, played a role in your thinking.
Of course, we discussed that a lot. When we discussed this, we want to achieve demand which is effective from a climate perspective and efficient as well. So demand for CDR is not a goal per se, but we want to reach our climate goals. So we have to always account for emission reduction as well. So what is more efficient, emission reduction or CDR? So we have to keep that in mind. So we, at this point in time, it's good to start scaling up CDR, of course. But as, for example, Sophie just mentioned, DAX plays no role in Switzerland because they don't have enough electricity, which makes sense to use for DAX. Same is the discussion in Germany at the moment. We still have a way to go to have enough energy for our reduction needs, yeah, to provide electricity, to provide heat, to provide fuels from renewables. So the question is how high should that demand be? And yeah, that said, we still have to wait for the new government, how it really takes off and how we want to prioritize it. We discussed, of course, different options in including into the European emission trading, for example, in Germany internally. And when we spoke to the companies, they told us, yes, but the price which can be achieved in the European emission trading is not enough to make CDR, for example, DAX feasible. So it's a really tricky question. Yeah, still some discussion ongoing, and I can't at the moment I can't say we were doing this or that because we had so many options under discussion. But we need to wait for the new government and decide how we will go forward. What we really see, as you mentioned, the voluntary carbon market plays a huge role at the moment, and it's great. And when I spoke to projects like in Norway, Breivik, they want to start CCS at the cement plant this summer, I suppose, or in June, they told me. And they also said they have this funds now for a couple of years where they do 50% of the emissions they capture and transport for storage. But they still don't know how it will go on later, how to intend to finance it later on. So it's not only a question for CDR, but lots. Yeah, the whole market for high value emission reductions or CDR is not yet there when we look at the price level of the European emission trading. Yeah.
If I may say something on that, I think that if the objective is only to have a climate neutral European emission trading, and we think that ETS emission reduction can be achieved at a cheaper price than removal, and at the end we don't need removal, and I will say all fine if we manage to do it. Why not? If we can do everything with emission reduction and without removal, that's perfectly fine. The problem is that emissions is not only about the sectors covered by the ETS. This is also the sectors that are outside the ETS, and some of them we know that we cannot get to zero. Also, I have my doubt that we can reduce everything to zero in the ETS, of course, but let's take a very hypothetical example. And also the point is that as for Germany, as for Europe, we want to go after 2050 beyond just neutrality and to generate negative emissions, because it's quite unlikely that at global level will reach neutrality, and we are going to overshoot these 2 degrees targets, and we need to reduce emissions. And we have, I think, as a developed country, some responsibilities on taking CO2 out of the atmosphere beyond neutrality. And for that, there is no other ways than carbon removal. So the question is how you manage to go there, and how you develop the demand across this journey that we have to do towards 2050. And I would say that the sequencing is very important. The short, very short term, the midterm with the link to the ETS, etc., with cost efficiency, and the long term, where if we need more removal that we can reduce emissions or net removals, you will need some kind of removal obligation on someone who the society has to pay, someone else, we will have to find a way. But just, we do not have so much time, but I would like just to focus 1 minute on the short term. We are working on a purchasing program for carbon removal to try to develop options. And I think that what Switzerland and Sophie are developing in Switzerland with putting some obligation at the corporate level to be climate neutral is extremely interesting. And we should try to also get benefit for the test case that Switzerland is developing. I think it will be super interesting for us to look at how it's working. Also, what kind of obligation it is. If the company do not comply with this obligation, what are the consequences? How gradually you put that in place? And yeah, this is definitely something that will be very much, we are very much interested to follow, yes.
And Sophie, can you, because I find it so interesting what Switzerland is doing here, can you maybe quickly explain to the audience, what exactly you're doing with regards to incentivizing corporate demand, and also this kind of carrot and stick approach that you have that for compliance, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, sure. So again, the stick, the stick is the binding net zero emissions obligation for companies by 2050, the latest. However, it's a small stick still, because there are no legally binding sanctions involved if you don't reach the target. But it's a binding long-term view of where all Swiss companies have to go, and that includes obviously companies within the ETS and outside of the ETS. And now this was what we have at the moment to work with. After 2030, there may be a different policy situation, and until then, we will have a debate on how we can develop measures which are perhaps more binding, more stringent, which lead to more mandatory demand, perhaps. But we are not there yet. So what we're doing, or what our aim is now until 2030, within this framework and with this binding target there is at the horizon by 2050, is really to encourage companies to do early action, to start procuring, namely on the basis of these net zero company roadmaps that I had mentioned, where we issued guidance. I think I mentioned it as well in January on how they should develop measures to reduce. On the one hand, as Jörg said, it's absolutely central, to keep the pressure on the reduction, and that's why we propose two separate but parallel things. So do your reduction path, and in parallel work on the build-up path for CDR. And I mean, as of now, we cannot force anybody, but if anybody wants to, they do have tailwind from the government telling them this is a good thing. We recommend you do it. If you want to do scope 3, do scope 3. If you're a company which has likely no residual emissions by 2050, please still consider a build-up path. If you want, you can go net negative. So that is what we're doing now. And also, not to forget the targets for the Swiss administration by 2040, including scope 3, which are even more ambitious. And sooner or later, the Swiss administration will also have to likely procure CDR, and we're currently in discussions internally how we're going to do that, how much we will need, how much money we have available. So that's another element which is relevant in the short term when it comes to demand.
And I find that's so interesting, because for me, that's the first obvious place to start, is right, kind of achieving net zero within public administration, right? And all the opportunities that come there. But no, I just wanted to call out how valuable this type of guidance is for companies like Carbon Future, who talk to buyers every day, right? If we can point to, the Swiss government is really encouraging you to do this, right? This is a good thing. You should be doing this. And this is invaluable for us, because otherwise they hide behind all sorts of different other guidance that exists that allows them to basically not do anything, right? So I would really highlight the value that this type of guidance has. And yeah, Fabien, when you say you're following what the Swiss are doing closely, that's obviously music to our ears. So hopefully Europe will follow suit. We don't have a lot of time left. So maybe as a final question for all of you, maybe starting with Jörg, then Fabien, then Sophie, is just if you put yourself into the shoes of kind of a project like a CDR company trying to scale carbon removals in Europe today, maybe in Germany, in Switzerland, in Europe, what would be your advice to them? Like, should they stay in Europe, do it here? Why? Should they look elsewhere? Like, yeah, what would be your advice to a CDR company today? Jörg, if you want to go first, over to you.
Yeah, my advice would be just do it in Europe, in Germany. Of course. We need you. We need you. But please understand that sometimes things need time in Germany and as Europe as well. So as Fabien already said, we have our goals and we want to reach them. So we need you. We need the negative emissions, and we will find a way to scale up the CDR industry. Otherwise, we won't succeed. And Sophie mentioned they have goals for their administration. For our administration, we want to be net zero by 2030 on the federal level. So it's not all through CDR. Actually, it's with cooperation under Article 6 as well. So we'll see how much CDR will be used of until 2030. I hope most of it will be CDR, so we will really achieve net negative for our federal emissions. And not the whole of Germany, but for governmental institutions by 2030. Yes, it's part of our climate laws.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, so come to stay in Germany and build. Yes, we need you. So otherwise, we won't achieve our targets. And
Thanks,
trust the new government. I hope they have some good ideas to scale up CDR as well. Yeah.
We all hope so. Thanks. Over to you, Fabien.
Yeah, for me, I would say, yeah, if I decided to leave the European Commission and do my own business, I think definitely I will establish it in Europe. Why? It's because in Europe, yes, this is true. Sometimes we need a lot of time to agree on something, but when we agree on something, then we stick to it, and you have a very stable environment. And I think now the first step that we did on carbon removals with the CSCF that is almost ready, with what is coming, as I said, next year on the ETS, will really change the landscape of carbon removal in Europe, and Europe will become really a place where there will be a lot of business cases for carbon removal. And this is why what we see also when we are discussing, there is more and more stakeholders, more and more companies that started to develop their activity outside Europe, and now they are looking more seriously in Europe because they see how it's developing. So definitely, I think this is a good place to start a carbon removal business now.
Thank you, Fabien. Excellent. And Sophie, we don't have a lot of time left, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So Switzerland is interesting for buyers and sellers, in my view, because not only are we working on, so we're working on funding, we're working on the demand side encouragement, which we had discussed, but not only are we trying to have an encouraging and productive space for domestic projects, but we're also developing a framework for international projects, which can be accounted toward the Swiss targets, or potentially also the framework can be used to develop CDR credits or ITMOs, which can be accounted towards a company target. So I think that is the added value of Switzerland, that we have this growing experience also with Article 6 projects.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Jörg, Sophie, and Fabien. This was fantastic. Really enjoyed this conversation. I learned a lot, which means that hopefully the audience also learned a lot. And yeah, for the audience out there, make sure to follow Carbon Future. Make sure to sign up to our newsletter to keep you posted, and also to enjoy future webinars like this. And in that light, thank you to the speakers. Have a nice rest of your day or evening. And thanks everyone who tuned in for attending. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much, Sebastian.
Thank you.